This place was never meant to be beautiful. It was built for smoke, noise, and production. A massive whiskey factory on the edge of a growing city. For over a century, it helped fuel Toronto's economy, shape its identity, and export its influence around the world. Then, it was abandoned, and somehow, it came back, not as a factory, but as one of the city's most unique cultural spaces. This is the story of the Distillery District. To understand the Distillery District, you have to understand Toronto when it was still young. In the early 1800s, what we now call Toronto was still the town of York, a small, muddy, lakeside settlement with more ambition than infrastructure. Roads were rudimentary, the harbor was shallow, the economy was growing, but slowly. Most businesses were small scale, and industry had barely taken root. Into this landscape came two men, James Worts, a miller from Suffolk, England, and William Gooderham, a businessman and Worts' brother-in-law. Together, they envisioned a business venture that would harness the abundant grain growth across Upper Canada and help supply the rapidly expanding settlement. In 1832, they constructed a windmill on the lakeshore, though the shoreline back then sat far north of where it sits today. The city's waterfront has expanded outwards over the decades due to landfilling. But at the time, the mill looked out over Lake Ontario. It was tall, functional, and purpose-built for grinding grain. No one knew it then, but this modest mill was the seed of what would become a world-famous whiskey empire. Mills produce more than flour. They produce excess grain, and excess grain meant opportunity. Distilling whiskey was a practical and profitable way to transform surplus grains into a product with longer shelf life and higher value. By 1837, the company added its first distillery building, shifting focus from milling to whiskey production. For the next century, that decision would define their legacy. When James Worts died suddenly in 1834, after the loss of his wife, Gooderham became the sole owner for a while before hiring Worts' eldest son. The new partnership, Gooderham and Worts, quickly became synonymous with precision, expansion, and ambition. Toronto was changing. Immigrants were arriving in large numbers. New railroads were linking the town to markets across the colony, and whiskey demand was exploding. Gooderham and Worts wasn't just in the right place at the right time, they were ahead of the curve, and the distillery grew accordingly. From 1850 onwards, Gooderham and Worts transformed into a sprawling industrial complex, one that would eventually stretch across more than a dozen acres and include over 40 buildings. This wasn't random growth. It was carefully planned, designed by two architects who left a lasting imprint on the district's appearance, David Roberts Sr. and David Roberts Jr. The Roberts were masters of industrial architecture. They understood how to build structures that were not only functional but also strong, fire-resistant, and monumental. Their work gave the complex its signature look: thick limestone and brick walls, heavy timber framing, massive multi-story warehouses, long, narrow passageways, and structures aligned for easy movement of grain, barrels, and workers. One of the district's architectural jewels is the Stone Distillery, built between 1859 and 1861. Constructed from Kingston limestone hauled across Lake Ontario, it was a masterpiece of industrial engineering, housing mashing vessels, fermenters, stills, and storage areas all within one imposing building. Inside, beams of old-growth wood spanned enormous distances. Floors were designed to withstand heavy loads. Thick walls kept interior temperatures stable, essential in an area before refrigeration. These design choices weren't artistic, they were practical, but over time, they became aesthetic too, forming the raw industrial beauty we admire today. And this building was nearly destroyed by fire. In its first years, a massive blaze tore through parts of the complex, but the stone walls held. Workers spent days pumping water manually to keep the building intact. By the 1860s, Gooderham and Worts wasn't just a successful distillery. It was the largest distillery in the British Empire and one of the largest in the world. At its peak, it was producing millions of gallons of whiskey each year, exporting across Canada into the United States, the Caribbean, South America, and even Europe. The complex operated with a precision that was ahead of its time. Immense grain elevators stored wheat, corn, and barley. Conveyors moved ingredients between buildings. Steam engines powered much of the machinery, and the distillery's location, next to the original Don River mouth and close to the expanding rail network, allowed for efficient shipping. In the 19th century, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was currency, medicine, and a staple of colonial life. Taverns served it by the barrel. Doctors used it therapeutically. Farmers accepted it in trade, and Gooderham Worts was supplying an enormous portion of it. Toronto was industrializing, and the distillery was one of the beating hearts of that transformation. It provided jobs, supported shipping businesses, and helped define the economic identity of the young city. But no boom lasts forever. The 20th century brought a series of disruptions that gradually chipped away the dominance of Gooderham Worts. The restrictions on alcohol due to the prohibition severely impacted production. Additionally, export markets shifted and regulations tightened. As a result, consumption patterns changed. By the 1920s and 30s, whiskey was no longer the dominant drink it once had been. Competition was also innovating. Modern distilleries with updated equipment and cheaper production methods emerged, making the Victorian-era operations at Gooderham Worts more expensive to maintain. The complex was massive, almost too massive, and aging. As Toronto grew, its waterfront shifted from industrial to commercial and residential use. Factories and mills began to leave the urban core. Transportation networks changed. Rail lines that once served the distillery became less essential, and the Don River's role in shipping goods faded. By the 1950s and 60s, the area around the distillery had become a patchy landscape of declining factories, empty lots, and underused portlands. The once bustling complex was becoming increasingly isolated from Toronto's economic engine. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Gooderham Worts ceased distilling operations in the 1990s. Some buildings were used for bottling and storage into the late 20th century, but the industrial chapter was closing. The site that once symbolized Toronto's industrial ambition became a ghost of its former self. But its architecture, largely intact, untouched, and historic, remained. And that would change everything. Before the Distillery District became a cultural hub, it had an unexpected in-between life: film set. During its final years in the 1980s and 90s, filmmakers discovered the area's striking heritage industrial aesthetic. The untouched Victorian buildings, narrow alleys, and pre-electric era ambience were perfect backdrops for period movies. As a result, the site became one of the most filmed locations in Canada. Crews would set up in the old tank houses or storage buildings. Streets would transform into 19th century London or New York. Brick walls were often repainted, sometimes several times, and then re-weathered to blend in again. Many residents at the time didn't even realize how often the distillery stood in for another city. Movies like X-Men, Chicago, The Fly, and Cinderella Man had scenes shot at the distillery. Ironically, the film industry played a crucial role in preserving the buildings. Instead of being demolished, they were maintained just enough to be usable for productions. The more they appeared in movies, the more Torontonians realized what a remarkable historic site they had. The complex was just waiting for someone with vision. And that someone arrived in 2001, when the site was purchased by Cityscape Holdings in partnership with Dream, then known as Dundee Realty. Their idea was ambitious and unusual. Not condos, not offices, not a tourist trap. They envisioned a pedestrian-only, arts-driven neighborhood, grounded in heritage. From the start, they decided against leasing space to big corporate chains. Instead, they wanted independent businesses, artisan workshops, galleries, cafes, craft distilleries, and local creators. They wanted it to feel authentic, distinct, and human. Restoration began immediately, and it wasn't easy. Many buildings required structural reinforcement. Decades-old paint had to be carefully removed. Wooden beams were examined, polished, and reinstalled. Cobblestones were repaired by hand. Thousands of original bricks were salvaged and reused. The developers worked closely with heritage architects and craftspeople to ensure the district didn't lose its character. During restoration, workers discovered that one of the old malt house floors still had a faint, lingering smell of grain, decades after production had ceased. The scent had infused into the wood. The project aimed to preserve, not reinvent, and on May 22, 2003, the Distillery District officially opened to the public. It was unlike anything Toronto had at the time, a place where old-world industrial architecture met creative energy. A place that felt simultaneously historic and modern, and people loved it. Every corner of the Distillery District contained stories, some big, some subtle, some hidden in the details. Most of the district's 40-plus buildings are examples of Victorian industrial architecture, each with characteristic features. These were not meant to be beautiful, they were meant to be functional. Yet today, they exude a charm that modern buildings rarely match. The quirky, winding layout of the district isn't charming by accident. It follows the original industrial circulation patterns, lanes placed specifically for the movement of wagons, grain carts, horses, and later small locomotives. Even street names, like Mill Street, remind visitors of the very beginnings, the mill that started it all in 1832. Today, the Distillery District is one of Toronto's most celebrated cultural destinations, but beyond the cafes, boutiques, and photo spots, its importance goes deeper. The district is one of the largest and best preserved collections of Victorian industrial architecture in North America. It stands as a model for adaptive reuse, showing how old industrial sites can be transformed into thriving urban spaces without losing their character. The area is known, among other things, for art galleries, outdoor installations, cultural festivals, the Toronto Christmas Market and other seasonal events, and live performances and theater productions. When you walk through the Distillery District today, you're experiencing nearly 2 centuries of Toronto history in real time. It remains one of Toronto's most remarkable places, not because it has the oldest buildings or the most shops or the best snacks, but because it carries the past into the present with grace, character, and purpose. The Distillery District is a reminder that cities are more than steel and concrete. They are stories. And this is one Toronto will keep telling, even when the bricks are no longer there. If you like this type of content and would like to learn more about the environment that surrounds us, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. And stay tuned for more.